talk about Michigan's African American Regiment during the Civil War, which was the 102nd United States Colored Troops, otherwise known as the 1st Michigan Colored Infantry. They were the first and only African American unit to come out of Michigan during the time of the Civil War. So let's dive back in. We start here in the early part of the war. At the beginning of the war, I'd like to do a disclaimer. Let me back up. Unfortunately, there are not really any photos of these men known. There's only 2 or 3 that are really known to be classified of the regiment during its time of service. So a lot of the photos that I use are example photos from other regiments across the country, including the one here. So at the beginning of the war, African Americans were not allowed to fight in the engagements, although we know that African Americans have been fighting in every American conflict back to the time of the American Revolution. So at the beginning of the war, what the Union Army was finding is as they were going into the South and getting into the engagements and setting up camp, is that a lot of the slaves there who were seeking freedom, they were seeking to make it to the North, and they were running up to the Union soldiers, coming up to them, seeking freedom. They're freedom seekers. And one of the generals who kind of had a large problem with this was General Butler, and he was having an issue where there's kind of a noise here. He was having an issue with a lot of the African Americans coming up to him and seeking that freedom, and it kind of started to become an issue for them. So what he decided to do was ask President Lincoln if he could take them in and make them soldiers and be a part of the army and do work and such. But his request was denied. So what he did, but that doesn't solve the problem, right? They're still surrounded, they're not going away. So what he decides to do is kind of go against Lincoln here a little bit, is he decides to take them in as property of war, as contraband, because the Confederate States considered the slaves to be property. He says, well, if they consider them property, then I can take them, their property, as contraband of war. So he puts them to work. And a lot of these escaped slaves become contraband and work for the army. They weren't paid, but later in the war they did. Some of them did start to get paid as they became more servants. We could get some paid. But by that time, a lot of them were just joining up and becoming soldiers in the army. Similar to a couple of the men who fought in the Michigan's Colored Regiments, they were contrabands who worked for the army before they could fight. Which I will tell the story of one. So the Emancipation Proclamation comes on January 1st, 1863, which declares all people in the South to be henceforth free. They're no longer slaves in the South. But what this also does, one of the hugest things that this does for the North, is this now allows blacks into the Union Army for the first time ever, legally allowing them to take up arms to be a Union soldier. And this is major for a lot of men, including here in Michigan, who have been wanting to fight, wanting to join forces in the fight for freedom, to preserve the Union. But every time they go to sign up, to take up their rifle, to go down to fight for the freedom of others, where their wives and babies don't, some slaves and kids, they are told no, because the military does not allow it. So this is a major thing that now they can go and sign up to be part of the army. So here in Michigan, we had a man who unfortunately we don't have a photograph of. His name was Henry Barnes. He was the colonel of this regiment, who was a large abolitionist in Detroit, and he was the editor of the Detroit Advertiser and Tribune, which was the Republican paper at the time, a large abolitionist newspaper. He was constantly advocating from the beginning of the war for Union or African American Union troops to be able to join the front. However, he knew that it wasn't allowed, and he was working hard to do such. So he wrote to Governor Blair, who's pictured here on the left, who was out of Jackson, and he wrote to Governor Blair and said, let me raise a regiment of African American soldiers. And unfortunately, while Governor Blair was a Republican and large abolitionist himself, who believed in African Americans being able to fight, he had to ultimately deny that request, because this was before the Emancipation Proclamation was passed. So even though he wanted it, he knew that the federal government would not allow it. And he did try, because he did try to talk to the Secretary of War, and they said no. So he did try. So as you can imagine, once the Emancipation Proclamation was passed, Henry Barnes just ran Governor Blair's front door, saying, now is the time. Now it's allowed. Let us raise this African American regiment. And his request was approved. So recruiting began in the spring of 1863. We got approval, in the spring of 1863. And this jumps into our recruiting efforts, which begins with August 12th of 1863. Now the recruiting is on to raise the regiment. The fight is on. But they had a tough time. Now, there were a lot of soldiers, individuals who wanted to fight in the war. He had a tough time recruiting because the biggest issue that he had is that initially this regiment did not have any bounties to join. So what he was finding was that a lot of the African Americans who wanted to enlist, they were going to Indiana, they were going to Illinois. They even went and joined the famous 54th Massachusetts. If you've seen the movie Glory, you know that regiment that fought at Fort Wagner. People from Michigan were going and joining there because they were getting these bounties. So it was, you kind of think, well, why would you travel far for that? Well, in their point of view, why join this regiment and get no money to begin with when you could go down to Indiana and make some money right off the front? So they just went to the front.
What were the bounties?
They arranged. They were quite a variety. So I've seen bounties as high as $300, and more. So it varied. Excuse me, I take that back. That was substitutes were around $300. I have to remember and look at what exactly the bounties what was the common bounty. So one of the issues that he had was he couldn't get the bounties. But what helped to get some of this in there was that some of the local communities started putting up money for the bounties. So while he couldn't get it from larger sources, the community said, well, we want to support this effort to raise African American soldiers. We will give you the money to help enlist men in the area. And another thing that happened was the draft. In March of 1863, we've seen the bloody 2 years of the war. We've seen 1861, 1862, battles like Antietam and Fredericksburg that were brutal. And the Union Army was losing troops like no tomorrow, going through troops. So what they decided to do, and they weren't getting, even white soldiers, they weren't replenishing their ranks fast enough, so they issued the draft. And what Michigan decided to do is add a line that said for every white man who was drafted, he could pay a black man to go and fight in his place. And a white man was removed from the state's draft quota. So what was happening is if you were the son of a wealthy businessman, the son of a politician, or whoever you were, or if you had the money, if you were drafted, you could pay someone to go in your place to fight for you. And this ends up being quite a large number. So a regiment usually consists of about 1,000 men. This regiment ultimately sees a number of 1,400 men. And over 254 men, that's 16%, were substitutes, where people were drafted, white men were drafted, and they were hired by the white man to go in his place. That's 2.5 companies of this regiment. No other unit in Michigan history has something like this. This is strictly with the 102nd unit that we're seeing, the 1st Michigan at the time. But what would happen, we talked a little bit about the money, is what would happen to the people who were substitutes, because they would pay up to $300, a large amount of money, because they did not want to go and fight. So they'd pay someone else. In other states, what would happen is the men would go and join, they would enlist, and then they would get paid their bounty. I mean, it could be $50, $20, whatever it would have been. They'd get their money, and then they'd wait for the right time. In all cases, if you had $300, you were pretty well set. That might be more than they'd make the entire time in the service, so they were only getting paid $7, $10 a month. They would go and they would leave the regiment. They would abandon it. Legally, they would leave because they had the money, they wanted to be part of it. But this regiment sees almost no runaways. But part of that is the reason that they were stationed in the deep South, places like South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. So if you ran away, you were either going to be put back into slavery or you were going to be killed. So you were better off staying in the service with your other men and continue your service until you got home. And that's what the majority did. So I want to talk a little bit briefly about one man you get there, we are, who was a servant. This is another example of an example photo. Unfortunately, we don't have a photo of Mr. Parker Bond. But man, he was a servant, and locally. So Mr. Parker Bond was a servant, a paid servant in the officers' hall at Fort Wayne, pictured here on the left in Detroit. A lot of people don't know that we have this quite massive fort, a star fort, in particular in Detroit, that still stands. And he was there. He worked in the barracks building there, as in the officers' hall and mess hall. And he was sought out by local leaders to help with recruiting and help with the regiment because he was a large advocate, a large interested person in military drilling. So you can see the drill field kind of out in the middle. They said he was constantly looking out the windows, watching the soldiers drill, and he wanted to be a part of it. So when this regiment was being raised, he was one of the first people they said, "We got to get this guy in here." And they immediately promoted him to be the drill master, and the highest rank that you could get as a African American man, which is a sergeant major, which is a non-commissioned officer. No men of the African American race were allowed to be commissioned officers and carry a sword during the war. So the highest rank you could get was sergeant major. So they immediately put him in there, and he became the drill master, seeing that he had some time to be around the soldiers at Detroit Fort Wayne. After the war, he became a successful businessman. I don't remember, I believe it was shoes. I normally don't by heart, I'm looking to that, what he did. But I thought that was a neat story of someone who was paid to be kind of be a part of Michigan military in a way. When the time came, he quit his job and said, "I'm joining up this, and I'm fighting for others." Sojourner Truth. You may know Sojourner Truth, who is, kind of has a lot of parts in the Battle Creek area. And she was a large abolitionist across the country, and she had a large part to do with this unit. She was an advocate across the entire state for people to join this regiment. She actually visited Detroit 2 times off the top of my head, where she brought gifts for the soldiers, joined them in their Sunday service, and was really a cheerleader almost to say this is the time. She's going city to city saying, join this regiment. We now have the time in this state to join. A year ago we couldn't join and fight. Now is the time. So I also tell this story. A lot of people don't know that she had some involvement with this regiment. So the camp of the Colored Regiment. So the 102nd is stationed, the 1st Michigan Colored Regiment at this time, is stationed at Camp Ward, which is near Elmwood Cemetery in Detroit. And it's actually at the far outskirt of town at that time. You know, the cemeteries were built on the outskirts of town, and unfortunately, they put their Colored Regiment way out on the outside of the town, far away from everything else going there. But they built the camp. They kind of built it from scratch. They had some barracks already did the Detroit barracks, but they reoccupied those, added more. They had a quartermaster's depot, a guardhouse, sutler's shop. They had comfortable quarters with wood and such. So they literally built it from the ground up. But they found out that they reported in the newspaper that the contractors that they hired did a shoddy job because the winter of 1863 was brutal. And they had issues with no floors in there. The roof was creaking or leaking. They had snow drifts coming in. They were getting snow in the barracks coming in. They didn't have enough blankets for the soldiers. So it actually got so bad that they had several men freeze to death because the winter was so bad. And then they went farther to actually send the entire regiment into Detroit, into the city, to find shelter. They told them to abandon the camp and go find somewhere to stay in the city. Now here's the problem. The recruiting that they had came from all over the state. Now a lot of them came from the west side of the state, over here. They went to Detroit to join. They didn't know anyone in Detroit. So they were sent into the town to go find shelter, and that didn't really work out for a lot of people. Unfortunately, as I said, several men froze to death at the camp. It got so bad. And here's what I find really interesting. I like to share this. A couple slides ago, I showed you this big, massive military fort that's on the little other part of town there. They were never, ever invited to go to this fort. Never welcomed there. And there's almost no, I've had a long time to study this, there's almost no records mentioning anything to do with the fort. It's intentionally almost not talked about there. But it's astounding where you have men freezing to death, and these men are not allowed to go to Detroit's historic Fort Wayne. The men eventually make their way back to the camp. It gets bad, so bad that they sent the federal army came in. I think it was a surgeon, that was his title, but excuse me, came in, and he ordered the city to take care of, order the state of the city to take care of it. So they had to go through, refix the things that were wrong, and really remake the camp so it could be habitable, because the men needed to go out to the east to fight. Another thing that was a really large issue with the camp, and then the recruiting process that had an issue on that, was I mentioned how Henry Barnes was a recruiter, or an abolitionist, and editor for the Detroit Republican paper, and Advertiser and Tribune. Well, the Detroit Free Press, which still exists today, was the Democratic paper. They did not like this regiment by any means, and because they felt that African American soldiers could not be soldiers. They felt that they were not supposed to be in the Union Army, and they constantly advocated to get the regiment out of Detroit. You can imagine when all the men left the camp because it was freezing to death, they were immediately jumping on them, saying how it was terrible, they're invading the city, get them out of here. It was a rough time, and they bashed Henry Barnes. So this was kind of a detour for people to recruit, because they're reading this in the paper, and they're like, well, I don't know if I want to be a part of that. So it's all added to the effect of trying to build their numbers, and they're having a tough time. But equipping the men. So the men wore the blue suit that we all know today, and they had quite a variety. All three of these men, the man on the right is actually unidentified, but it's believed he is a soldier in the second, based off his uniform when he was taken in Detroit. But the man in the center is Mr. Kitchen Artist. On the left is Samuel Lett. And you see Mr. Kitchen Artist in the center here. He's actually wearing the shoulder scales. The gentleman on the right has a nice frock coat. The man on the left is a roundabout. They have quite a variety. And there's a kind of a larger misconception, it's true in some cases, where the Union Army only gave, or the states, gave this African American soldiers junk. They gave them scraps. And that did happen in some cases. However, in Michigan, especially with our governor at the time, they wanted to show off just how well these black soldiers could be. So they put them in some of the finest uniforms, they said in the paper. And that's really true on the right. You can see it's the frock coat. This is a dress coat that they often wore to the ball at the time of service. Most of the men got 2 coats at the beginning of the war, and then they needed more coats and stuff. So they said, well, you get 1 coat or the other, they don't get both. But they gave them some of the nice coats. And they were in the blue uniform by September 25th, and there was something saying that just as fast as they came into camp after that, they got a blue suit and they were ready to go. And they really did a really great job of showing off the soldiers. There's accounts of the men marching down Woodward Avenue in Detroit, marching handsomely, and the people coming out cheering them on. But then we tie back into the Detroit Free Press, because the regiment could march down the street. They could be 230, 300 men strong, marching handsomely down the street to the sound of the drum. And the Detroit Advertiser and Tribune would publish and say they marched down the street handsomely, people came out, cheered them on, and we are very happy to have this regiment in uniform moving forward. Well, on the other hand, the Detroit Free Press would publish an article saying they came into town and they caused a ruckus, nobody wants them here, they look like junk. And I actually, when I started researching, I was researching using the Detroit Free Press, and I'm thinking, what the heck's going on with these guys? And then I found that there's more to the story. But I'll tell you, unfortunately, the Detroit Free Press went so far to dehumanize these individuals to title an article calling it "The Raid of the Ethiopians," really trying to just say these men are terrible, we don't want them, do not join this regiment. And we talk a lot about news today. I won't name news company, news organizations, but you can use your imagination just going back and forth, back and forth. And that ties right back, 100 years ago. These newspapers were your source of information, and they are just hammering out. If you picked up one paper or another in the city of Detroit, you had 2 different worlds going on, except for which one you wanted. And it was up to a place like Holland to decide which one they're going to publish. So there was even more out there, but they're having a recruiting problem still. So what they decided to do, they thought about it, so what are we going to do? So what they decided to do, Lieutenant Colonel, Will T. Bennett, they decided to take the men on a grand southern tour. And just before they left, they had a gentleman donate $550 for instruments for a band. So they were able to train the band in the regiment, which was very rare for a variety of regiments. During the war, at the beginning, each regiment had a band, but It's just as soon as they were going through numbers and people, you lost your instrument and you were given a rifle. So this is rare at this time, but this regiment had a brass band, and they traveled with the Michigan Southern Railroad, which no longer exists today. It's all torn up now. A lot of walking trails, and stuff like Jackson. But it kind of followed south of I-94 and then even went farther down towards Vandalia and such. But they went on a southern tour, and this is the first time that the railroad is fully utilized in a war in the whole world. And we see how this is the impact of that. It would take 2 months by foot to travel to the East Coast, where just in 7 days you could get to the East Coast, and sometimes shorter, during this war. So they took on a southern tour, and they stopped in places like Ypsilanti, Ann Arbor, Marshall, Kalamazoo, Dowagiac, and when they stopped in Jackson, that's where the governor lived, they gave a grand speech. The governor gave a grand speech. They had breakfast before. They really treated them well. It was a very big deal. But at every stop, the brass band would get off. They would start playing music. The men would start marching down the street, and there's accounts of hundreds and thousands, in some cases, coming to the streets to see the black soldiers. As you can imagine, it's 1860s, there's not too often that a brass band and soldier, especially after marching down the street. So this was a big deal. And to see what they were getting, and this showed the newspaper, this told the Detroit Free Press that you were wrong. Because people are now seeing in their face that these men are here, and they're here to do business, to join the regiment. And this was a success. They raised a lot of awareness and got recruits. And when an African American would get back into town and he missed it, they would tell him, I said, you missed it. You got to get part of this. There was a whole regiment of black soldiers here. So this turned out to be a huge success. Except in Vandalia, where the colonel, unfortunately, his horse got a little upset, and he flew him back in the air, and he fell off and busted his back a little bit. So the colonel was out of shape, and I think he rode the train back pretty into rough shape. But that was a neat story. So the men's battle flags. I want to talk really quickly about the battle flags. Let's spend a little time. The battle flags were the heart and the pride of every Michigan regiment, every soldier, every regiment across the country. And some of these regiments had their own custom battle flags that were tailored just for that regiment. And this was the case for the African American regiment as well. This flag was painted by Mr. Robert Hopkin, who is a worldwide renowned artist. You go to the DIA, the Detroit Institute of Arts, he has a lot of artwork on there. And he painted a couple of Michigan battle flags, at least 3. Did some amazing work, and this is one of them here. And these flags were presented to the men in January of 1864, on a very snowy day in Detroit, but people poured out for this ceremony. On one side of this flag, it was customly hand painted. This is silk. These are 6 by 6.5 foot flags. They're huge and hand painted silk. It costs a lot of money. On one side was the state seal, which I believe would be, it's kind of hard to see, I believe would be on our left side here, would be the state seal. And then with the words on it, presented by the Colored Ladies Soldiers Aid Society of Detroit to the 1st Michigan Colored Regiment, 1863. These are the wives, these are the daughters, these are the family members of these soldiers who put their money, who put their labor into helping ensure that they got this battle flag. And on the other side, what was described as an eagle guarding the banner of the Union. I have not been able to find an exact picture of what that would have looked like based off the paint that's still left on the flag. But on there was the motto, all men are born free and equal to realize which we fight. And that's where the title of this presentation comes from, free and equal. That was the motto that these men went by. These soldiers here, that's what they looked at when they were in the bloody battles, or they were in the camp and it was dark and cold and they were away from home, hot in some cases. Born free and equal. And then on the other side, presented by the Soldiers Aid Society of Detroit, the woman, this was home, this battle flag. Under no conditions were you to ever let the enemy get your battle flag. There's stories of true bravery happening underneath these battle flags. Really, really, really incredible work. But this is their flag. As you can see, where is it? Where is the center of the flag? The flag is over 150 years old, and that silk cracks, even right after the war, starts to crack and such. And in some cases, they cut it out to give to the soldiers. But on the bottom left, that's what the flag looked like straight out of the state archives a couple of years ago. And we pulled it out, we were looking at it, and we realized there's more of the flag, and it was kind of rolled up. So we worked with an organization called the TPA over in Virginia, and they've done a lot of great flags, even including the flag that flew over Iwo Jima, which is a different war, but a lot of incredible flags. The state spent a lot of money for a collection, and we were able to conserve the flag, not restore it, conserve it, and that's what's left of it. And through a newspaper article, we were able to see what the words on the battle flag were and piece it together. So now you can kind of see some of those words on there, but the actual design of the flag, unfortunately, has faded away through its time and use. But you can see all of the state battle flags that are in the collection if you schedule an appointment with the Michigan State Capitol or the Archives of Michigan. And they have two other flags. The regular stars and stripes on the left. You can see these are quite decayed too. The stars and stripes on the left, and on the right, the normal eagle that a lot of the regiments were given as well. As I said, under no conditions were you ever surrender the flag. At the Battle of Gettysburg, the 24th Michigan lost 7 color bearers in one battle. Just one. You were to protect this flag at all costs. And these men did as they returned home with their battle flags. That same day, after they were awarded their battle flags and given them, the men in return at the same time also presented the enlisted men presented their lieutenant colonel with a custom sword of $130, which today is $2,200. It was a beautiful sword, and it had his name on it, saying it was from the non-commissioned officer and privates. So this is important, it's not from the officers, this is not from the white men who kind of had some money. These were from the privates and the non-commissioned. These were from people who came from nothing in some cases. They gave back, and that's why I tell this story, is because we see and we hear stories, which are true, about white men treating the soldiers like trash and not appreciating them. That wasn't the case for this regiment. The men really appreciated their leaders. And this is a great example I loved when I saw this, because this is an example of saying, we respect you and you respect us. Here is a gift. And I thought that was something really cool to be shared here. So, trouble at Camp Warren. So, unfortunately, when the men are, like anyone, all the young men as well, when you're around in the camp in Detroit, you can find yourself in a little bit of trouble as you're around and you need things to do. Unfortunately, in some cases, this came from harassment, because you had a lot of people who were not supportive of the youth member. So these guys would go to the bar and get drinks like any other person, and they'd get harassed. Saying, what are you doing in that blue suit? You have no business. You're not, who are you? And in some cases, this caused an issue. So the men, unfortunately, a couple men got into a fight at one of the saloons nearby, and I can't pronounce it really well. Shabim's, I'm not going to say that well. And they got into a really bad brawl. And as you can guess, one of our friends in the neighborhood heard about this, the Detroit Free Press. And they jumped the next day saying, it's a ruckus, they're tearing up Barnes, they're calling, get them out of here. So Barnes has had enough, he's been fed up, so what he decides to do is order the men that they cannot leave the camp past 4 p.m. He restricts them to the camp, because it's not just for their sake, but it's also for the unit's sake, because he can't take any more negative press. You're trying to get out to fight, you're trying to train the men, and he can't be playing news tag back and forth with the Detroit Free Press. But the Detroit Free Press, of course, doesn't stop. And here's another thing that happens, and this is another band. I think this is the 6th USCT band, I believe. But this is an example of what that band would look like for the Colored Regiment. And the band would play at a variety of events in Detroit. They wouldn't just play for the soldiers. They were hired to play at balls that would occur, parades and gatherings. And one of the things they would do was play in a parade as the soldiers returned home. And some asked, well, why were the soldiers returning home? It was 1863. At the beginning of the war, they thought the war was only going to be very, very short. And a lot of those units signed 3-month papers, and then they rejoined for another 2 years, and the war went on longer. So a lot of these 2-year units were returning home from the war, and a lot of them did end up re-enlisting again for a third time in some cases, or second time, excuse me. And the men would perform as they got back from the train depot in Detroit and marched down the street and welcomed them home. And one of those units was the 10th Michigan Infantry, which was a white unit. The 10th Michigan Infantry arrived, and as I mentioned, the regiment is about 1,000 men approximately. I don't know the exact number of how many they had when they returned back from the war. I don't know how their engagements exactly. But when they returned, the colored band was there on the corner waiting for them to get off the train. And when they got off, every company besides one, a company of 100 men, every company besides one refused to march behind the black band. And this became a really big outcry. And this is, I shared this is really huge. This is a Union Army in the North, in Detroit, wearing the same uniforms that they are. And I think this once again ties into that question of, were all the men fighting for the same thing? And the answer is no, they were not fighting for the same thing. The fight for the black man is not always the same fight as the white man, for the white man in this war. And so that makes you wonder, what caused, approximately, for a random number of 900 men to say, we are not marching behind them? And another catch question is, what inspired the other 100 men to say we are going to do that? I mean, these are their brothers that they're saying, well, we're going to do it. So this is a really big topic, and the newspapers for almost a couple of days went back and forth, and even myself didn't get a real answer because they're just fighting back and forth on the reason why. I would love to find some accounts directly from the soldiers. I haven't looked into that too deep yet, saying why. Perhaps maybe there's something saying why the letter why they chose not to march behind the black soldiers. But because these men are in the Union Army, the point is they did not go without discrimination initially, and they faced it. There were great times of triumph, like when they received their uniforms or were given some better rifles and such. For example, the men started out with Austrian Lorenz rifles, which were Austrian made, and they shipped them over here. They weren't at the top of the line, but they were good. A lot of people had them. And when they were on the East Coast, they were inspected by General Foster, and General Foster said they had worthless guns. Get them new guns, and they got brand new Springfield rifles and some Lorenz rifles. So, it's an example of they had some really great times, but in other cases, and not about the other cases yet, they faced some really tough moments. And we're going to jump right into some other cases here. So the men left for Detroit on March 28, 1864. They rode in cattle cars. During that time, they all crammed in there, and the officers would ride in nice passenger cars along the way to the East Coast. And that wasn't just because they were black soldiers. That was very common for all regiments to ride in cattle cars, where the officers got the nicer cars. So the men formed up, and they rent their wishes and marched down Woodward Avenue down to the train depot, and the streets were poured with people cheering them on to go fight in this war. This is where they're saying goodbye to their loved ones in some cases for the last time to go off and fight in this conflict. But as the men drove away on their train, somehow the whole camp ward became aflame and burnt down. And we don't know how this happened, how the whole camp, the same day that they left, was burnt down in the north. So it's a response to the question. In some cases, I'm not saying that it was targeted. It very well could have been someone left a candle on, or they put something too close to the fire and everyone left. So it could have caused a fire. But it is coincidental that the same day that 1,000, and there's been 900 men strong at the time left, that it burns down. It's very interesting. That's why there's really no photos or much left of Camp War today, because the same day they left, the same day it disappeared. And as the men are on their way on the train, they stop in Toledo, they're cheered on in Toledo and such. They're hearing a rumor that Colonel Barnes is going to resign. And this kind of really hurts morale, and he unfortunately does resign. And is replaced with Henry Chipman, who was the former colonel of the 2nd Michigan Infantry. He's a regular Army man. He's been in the Army since before the war broke out. So we might respect him. But the fact that Barnes resigned was a really big hit to the men. They just left. They're going to fight, and their colonel resigns. And I'm going to put this, and I can put this in a picture here. If we've all maybe been a part of a sports team, perhaps, and you have your coach, maybe you have someone who talked you into getting a part of that team, who may have been the coach, and then you go to your first game, and the coach says, "Have fun, I'm quitting, and best of luck," and it's raining, snowing, whatever it is, and you're like, "Well, you let us be here, why did you leave us?" And that's how a lot of the men felt. As you brought us in here, why are you leaving us? But Colonel Barnes stated that he is not a regular military male. He is an editor for the Detroit paper and is not a colonel to go fight in the regiment. And that makes sense, right? However, that was very common for random citizens to be officers during the war, during the Civil War. Like you can go to offices in the state capitol building today where there were legislators who later joined the war, who were still legislators or politicians, and then they raised a company, and then they became an officer in the army out of nowhere. You know? But he felt that was not the case for him, and he resigned. Barnes went through a lot. Barnes actually committed suicide in 1870s after the war. No one knows the exact reason why, but the newspaper accounts may have said he had a lot of failed business issues that may have caused him a lot of debt that may have built up. But then I also wonder too is, did the soldiers have an impact when the soldiers returned home and they're hounding the colonel as well for resigning? So draw some more questions. The arrival in Maryland. So the men finally reached the East Coast. They're there. They're finally part of the Army, and they are excited to be in service. That doesn't go as planned. When they arrive in Maryland, it is thunderstorming, and it's March going into April. So I think they arrive in April, very early April. And you know, April weather goes up and it goes down. And it's thunderstorming, and they talk about how it was brutal. The thunderstorm, they didn't have their equipment yet, and they said they could smell the dead bodies in the air that were returning from the south, and a lot were buried in Washington there. And it's downpouring, so the Lieutenant Colonel, Colonel Bennett, he requests that his men be able to use some of the empty barracks nearby because they don't have their tents yet, they just arrived, can they use some of the empty barracks? I think you know where this is going. The request was denied, stating that they were afraid that it would make some of the white soldiers angry there that were stationed in the nearby area. And that's another big hit. I mean, this is the federal army. You're a part of the army. You're here, and you can't even stay in the building. So the Michigan Colored Regiment, the African American soldiers, they slept outside on the ground with no tent. It's called campaigning. And when they awoke in the morning, it had begun to snow. And this was once again hit and blown in the face. And they also talked about during their time there how they hadn't got much money. They hadn't received pay. White soldiers were paid $13 a month, and the black soldiers were paid $10. And then they oftentimes deducted another $3 for uniform expenses, so they were paid $7 a month. And who here has seen the movie Glory by chance? Anyone here? Yep. Okay. So you know that scene where Denzel says, "Tear it up, we're not taking it"? That happens. That's not just a movie thing. The men from Michigan, a lot of them said, "I don't want it. If you're not going to give me what I'm worth, a full soldier, then I don't want your money. I don't need your money." And so that was something that they did talk about. Some of them didn't take their pay. Quite a few of them didn't take pay. The men were reviewed by General Burnside, pictured here on the right, and he said they made fine soldiers. So he was very excited about Michigan's African American Regiment. So I talked a little bit about the name 102nd. So what's up with this first Michigan Colored Regiment and 102nd? What is going on here? So what happens is once the 102nd reaches Washington, they now become a part of the federal army. Why is that? Because the Union Army was segregated after it was put together there for African Americans to be involved in the army. So they kind of create a whole separate branch, kind of like the Marines do today, the Air Force. They kind of create this whole separate branch called the Bureau of United States Colored Troops. And that was where all of the men that were of African descent were put a part of. And they became the 102nd United States Colored Troops. However, Michigan men, they did not like this. They felt, well, I'm not a colored troop, I'm not a colored soldier, I am a regular soldier just like everyone else. So they kind of ignored this name and still in their letters oftentimes went by the name 1st Michigan Colored Regiment. And it lasted a long time because when you go in the state capitol building, there are bronze tablets around where the battlefronts used to be, and those were installed in 1912. And on it says 1st Michigan Colored Infantry, not 102nd. However, when you visit graves today and such, you will either see USCT or USCI for infantry, and that was because the graves are federally paid for, so they're going to go by that federal name. But the men did not like this 102nd name. And the 102nd is not a specific title, that was just you got whatever number came next, and next line was 102nd, so they became 102nd United States Colored Troops. Their time on the East Coast. They were divided. They traveled via steamers and foot, so a lot of boat rides along there. They even got grenades in some cases. Yes. Yeah. Right.
So you said it was the 102nd Colored Troops.
Yes.
There were 101 other colored troops?
Yes. Yep. So I believe it went up to 166. I believe there were over 160,000 African American soldiers involved in the conflict, and as well as quite a few in the Navy, which is way under-researched for the black soldiers, the Navy in general during the Civil War. So yes. No, of course. So they traveled via steamers and foot. There's a lot of neat engagements that they were involved in, but they were not involved in any big battles, and that was intentional. The Union command generals did not want the blacks to be in the front. They felt that they were going to lose the war if they put the blacks in the front, that they were going to drop their weapons and run away. So they mainly put the majority of the black soldiers to do manual labor. Carrying up railroads, digging holes, building fortifications, a variety. And what they did with this regiment, because of that, is, I kind of go back to this team thing here. They took the team, the 1,000 men at the time, and they divided them into two wings, the left wing and the right wing, which is about 500 men each. And then there, they divided them into companies, which is 100 men each. And then from there, they went to platoons. So, and that was another big hit to the unit, because this is your friends, these are your brothers, your team, and you trained all together, you went to the bar together, whatever. And then you get to the East Coast, and they say, you go there, you go here, you go there. And that was not very common. It happened for some white units, but it wasn't a very common thing. You stayed together as a team, and with the black units, they often divided them up into a variety of a mix there. So this was a big hit to quite a few of the men. But they stayed pretty busy. They didn't stop them. They did picket duty in South Carolina. They did a lot of skirmishing, which are smaller battles. And one neat thing about this, well, I'll save that part coming up. But they actually got to go to a fort. I found this in my research. They were at Fort Walker, which also another name I'm blanking on. It's a picture here on the left, and they were trained how to use the heavy artillery during the time. And why this is interesting, there's a couple companies, I believe it was two companies under Captain Montague who were there, is the men who were in South Carolina could go into this fortification in the South, but they couldn't go back in Detroit to be a part of their own fort in their own town, but they can go to the South and occupy this one. So I thought that was neat, and that was something that was in any history book on the 102nd, and we're touching on that, so I thought that was a neat piece to find. Moving on. Their first battle. The Battle of Baldwin, Florida. So the men are down in South Carolina, and they're tearing up railroads. They're tearing up railroads because they want to make sure that the South can't use them. So they're sending a lot of these Union troops to go tear up railroads and cut the enemy lines up so they can't transfer, whether it's men, food, wood, ammunition. They want to make sure they can't use those. So the 102nd is tearing up railroads in Baldwin, Florida, which is on the northern part of the state, and they began hearing this noise, and this noise starts to grow louder and louder and louder into the woods. And the colonel, lieutenant colonel, makes the men form up, and they form up, and they put their bayonets on, and as soon as they are in line, rebel cavalry comes pouring out of the trees. And this is just like glory. I mean, they come pouring out of the trees, and the regiment fire a volley into the rebel cavalry, knocking down quite a few of them, but now what happened? They emptied all of their guns. So now the men are unloaded, and the rebel cavalry is still coming of what's left. So what do? They fight hand to hand to repel the rebel cavalry. And the commanders are nervous. They've never seen their white troops, their black troops in action. They're hearing all about the black soldiers are going to run. They're going to run. They're not going to fight. So these white commanders are nervous that they could be killed here if the black soldiers don't fight. And the 102nd showed that they are here to do business because they easily repelled the rebel cavalry attack without one man being killed. And you think about it, this guy on the horse, he has a pistol or a nice gun, and he has a sword, and you're here with him. Your friend. So they easily repel this rebel cavalry attack. And like I said, this showed the officers they are here to do business. And now I'll say, the 102nd went through, and through their entire service, never lost a single engagement within themselves. Like the next battle we'll talk about, the battle was lost as a whole, but their direct engagement where they were going one-on-one never lost a fight. And Michigan was very, very proud of this. One of their largest engagements that they were at, the largest I should say, was the Battle of Honey Hill, South Carolina, which was fought on November 30th of 1864. Three companies of the regiment, 300 men, were under the command of General Foster, and they were trying to get to the point of Honey Hill, South Carolina, and the rebel forces had beat them to that point and occupy that hill. So the Union Army was trying to make up ground and push the enemy back. Unfortunately, that did not go as planned. One of the units, the Union artillery that was on the field, had been decimated. There was basically nothing left of that Union artillery. And they quickly realized that if they don't get those guns are going to be turned back around and blast the Union soldiers to pieces. So what they do is they call upon the 102nd to go into the fight and get those guns. So Captain A. Rad Lindsay grabs his company of 100 men and they rush forward to go get the guns. And as soon as they rush forward, bam! Captain A. Rad Lindsay is killed instantly. His head is hit, and he is instantly killed. And the men continue to push forward to go after those guns. They get the guns, but they're getting hit left and right, and they ultimately fall back and are unable to move the guns back to Union lines, which is a couple hundred yards away. Yes.
Guns, what do you mean?
Yes. Yep. So they're under. Yep. They're trying to get cannons. Yep. So they're trying to get. I believe it was 2 or 3 artillery pieces that were on the field. But they're getting hit by musket fire, cannon fire, and such that is going all around them. So, a man by the name of Orson W. Bennett, was pictured here on the right, grabbed the detail of 30 men, and he says, all right, now we're going to go forward. Captain Orson W. Bennett rushed forward with his company, and they were able to get those guns back a couple hundred yards off the battlefield. And the men, what's interesting and important about this is while they were moving those guns, they're huge guns, they're getting hit in the arm, they're getting hit in the left. While many of them weren't killed, they were hit and they were wounded. And these are bullets about the size of my thumb. These are 58 caliber balls that they're being hit with, and they're still pushing forward. And they brought the guns back to the Union lines. And for this action, Orson W. Bennett was awarded the Medal of Honor for this. And there was another man, another engagement, I think his name was Henry Blanking, who was also awarded the Medal of Honor. He was a white commander. But if you notice here, the white officer awarded the Medal of Honor. And he did take part, right? And he did his credit, but where is the credit for the black soldiers who did? And there were a number of black soldiers throughout the war who were awarded the Medal of Honor, so it wasn't like none were. But this man, for this detail, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. No man in the 102nd that was a private or non-commissioned officer was awarded the Medal of Honor during the service. But this was a very, very, very big engagement for the men, and they even received more soldiers as they were out there during the war. I mentioned they left with 900 men, and they mustered out, their total roster, I should say, was 1,400 men. So what was happening is they kept getting these substitutes. It's I think it's interesting given the time, because they would have had to go down by train and to get with everybody else. But they kept getting more and more soldiers as they went. So they ended up being 1,400 strong totally through the time of service. So returning to Detroit, the war ended in April of 1865. However, they would actually end up making it back to Detroit until October because right after the war, they wanted to keep federal troops in the South to make sure there weren't any rebellions, to kind of quell them as they were in the very beginning, very, very beginning of Reconstruction after the war. So the men mustered out in Charleston, South Carolina on September 30th, 1865. A couple of the men actually chose to stay in South Carolina, coincidentally. And the full regiment fully returned to Detroit and Campus Martius. This is an example photo here of soldiers at Campus Martius in Detroit during the 1860s. They went back in wings. The first wing took a train all the way back to Detroit, how they came. The right wing, I believe it was, came and they went to New York, and then they took a boat across, a steamboat across the lake. But unfortunately, The first wing, left wing, that when they got to Detroit, they got a grand ceremony in the depot and welcome back for their service, and highly welcome back. But when the second, the right wing, was coming back across the river, across the the lake, the depot, the train depot where they had held these ceremonies, had burned down before. And this was 1800s. Things burned down. This was very common. Things burned down. They don't think this was intentional because of this regiment. This just happened to burn down. So they did not get the very grand opening ceremony that everybody else got. But they were very much welcome back home. Like the rest of them, just without the grand ceremony. But that was a neat fact they found. So after the war, the men participated in the GAR and a variety of parades. And the GAR is almost like today's VFW. This is where a lot of veterans took part in a lot of activities after the war. And they were welcomed in many cases, however, some not so. Some of the branches of the GAR across Michigan were integrated, where they had black and white, and some were just black GARs, and in some cases I think that was just because there were more blacks in that area, so they had a black GAR posts, particularly on the west side of the state. And some of them became successful businessmen. I mentioned Parker Bond, who was a successful businessman after the war, and quite a few of them ended up in the soldiers' home in Grand Rapids, Michigan, after the war, which is kind of, you weren't doing too good if you ended up going there. It was for health and poor, etc. But quite a few of them did end up going to the soldiers' home, and they took part in the GR and were welcome. They partook in parades and such, so they had their honors for it, and they were respected, but not always. They were always after the war, and this ties into here. So there's a man by the name of John Taylor. John Taylor was born into slavery in Kentucky, and he was captured by Union soldiers and became a servant for the Union. When I say captured, he was taken in by the Union soldiers for the Union Army, and became a servant. I talk about servants and contrabands for a chaplain in Hillsdale. He then, after when the chaplain returned home from the war, he joined up in the 102nd, the 1st Michigan Colored at the time, and decided he was going to fight for the freedom, because he was now old enough to fight, and he was going to fight. So after the war, Taylor serves all the way through the war. He returns to Detroit, serves the war, and he goes to work for a family in Ingham County in Mason. He worked for the family for just a little bit before he got into a disagreement with Mr. Buck, the Buck family, about wages. So Buck decided Taylor decided he was no longer going to work for Buck, and he needed his money. Well, Buck said, well, I don't have it right now. I have to come back another time and figure it out. So Taylor comes back another time, and Mr. Buck is not there. And he argues with the family, the wife, the daughter, and the grandma, saying, where's my money? I need my money. And there's different accounts of how the actual interaction went. But regardless, Taylor left and did not get his money. And a story broke and it got into the newspapers really quickly, that when Taylor was there, he had killed some of the family members and assaulted them while he was there. And this got into the newspapers. This became a huge thing. And Ingham County is a Democratic stronghold during the state in 1866. And they were not fond of this. So the sheriffs go and they find Mr. Taylor, and he went just northeast of Lansing, and he was in Bath, and they found him and brought him back and put him into jail. So that way he could go to trial and find more about this. Well, unfortunately, Taylor would not end up seeing the trial. The community was outraged about this report, this news that broke loose about him killing these family members, these white women, and they dragged Taylor out of the county jail in Ingham County, and they lynched him, and even went so far to account saying that they beheaded him ultimately for this. And this is one of 3 African American lynchings in Michigan history, and this story is not really well known at all. And what blows my mind, when I first learned about this, is that this is a veteran of the Union Army who had just, it's 1866, the war had just gone over. He was a veteran of the Union Army, he was young, he was a young boy. He was only 18 in the records when he enlisted in the fight. And they hung him and shot him, and his body was never found. But as I tie this into, after this happened, it came out that The family was totally fine. None of the family was assaulted or killed. And this happened. And to this day, John Taylor's body was never found. And they believe that he was buried in an area out of town in Mason, and they named the park Dead Man's Hill Park. And it was a common sledding area for many years. Just recently, around the time of, I want to say late 2019, 2020, I used to know it was just before the pandemic. You can see the photo here taken in the snow. And a historical marker was installed, remembering John Taylor's name, remembering the story and the work that he did during the war. And that came about from an Ingham County history teacher in the area who was familiar with Taylor's story and worked with a couple of historians to start to tell it to the news, and it made its way all the way up to the state level, getting a historical marker.
So where is the marker now?
It is at that park in Mason off of Cedar Street. It's not too far off the highway there at 127 in Mason, yep. And at the same time this happened, fittingly, the park was renamed John Taylor Memorial Park. We got under that real name, and it was named now after John Taylor. But this is, I tell the story, like I said earlier, they had triumphs. There was amazing pieces of the story. But there's also some very dark, I think this is one of the darkest stories of the 102nd in this whole history that we hear. That one of their veterans, one of their brothers, was lynched for a crime that he didn't commit, unfortunately. Was that your question? Just wanted to check. Yeah, amazing. So living on. So how is that story told? How are we remembering that unit? But one of the ways that this came about, helping to tell their story, is through a historical marker, which unfortunately I'm kind of covering up here. I should work on redoing this. Is Camp War. That was where the camp was stationed. This historical marker was actually dedicated after the 1967 Detroit riots that occurred. And this is a part of rebuilding Detroit that occurred. This is a huge ceremony. The NAACP was there, Governor George Romney was there, several other leaders were there. This was a really big rebuilding aspect, looking at past history of blacks in Detroit and the contributions that they had. A group of living historians, which you can see here in the top right, that I'm involved with, got involved when the reenactment was very high in the 80s. They started that here in Michigan Lansing, and we continued to build out. So myself, I'm a college student, and I have some other high school students as well in college. That we have our group of students, and we portray Michigan's African American Regiment, joining in uniforms together to keep that history. In 2013, Coleman A. Young Jr., Coleman A. Young, prominent mayor of Detroit, a lot of us know, his son was a state senator, and during his time, he passed a bill to have I-375 that goes through downtown Detroit to be named 102nd, renamed 102nd United States Colored Troops Memorial Highway. Unfortunately, that sign did not exist. They didn't have signage. They didn't pay for the signage. So our group raised some funds, about $3,200, and we got 2 signs that are now in Detroit on I-375 that are proudly displayed, sharing their story. However, unfortunately, those signs in the highway are going to be torn down as they're building it into a boulevard. It's a project across the country that they're doing these two as far as rebuilding their cities. So the 102nd Memorial Highway will cease to exist in a few years. And if you know Detroit history, this was Black Mountain neighborhood, where they had the neighborhood that was black neighborhood, and they ripped through it to build the highway. And then now we get the highway sign that talks about black history, and then we're going to rip that up. So the goal ultimately here is I'm trying to work with the city of Detroit to make sure that what happens, that these men are still remembered in that area, whether that's through a small monument or the name or a road designation, or it's like Memorial Road in their city. We're trying to make sure we remember that. 102nd USCT Day in Michigan. This is probably the biggest thing that came to the state legislature regarding this unit since it first came into existence. In 2021, in June, I keep forgetting to add the date on here, so apologies. The state legislature passed a proclamation under Representative Julie Alexander, Sarah Leitner, and the Michigan House Black Caucus to pass a resolution honoring the 102nd USCT Memorial USCT Day in the state of Michigan. So this was a really neat, really bringing their story back to the forefront of Michigan history and telling it to our legislators and people across the state. So It's went work through all the way around, and it's been a neat history to share. I'm happy to be able to share it with everyone. And that concludes my presentation tonight.
Thank you so much, Maurice, for being here, coming all the way from Jackson. We really appreciate that. Does anyone have any questions? We'll pass the microphone around. If you have any questions for Maurice, he can answer for you.
I love questions, so go ahead.
You said that some of the members were from West Michigan. Any numbers that you can come up with?
A lot. And I unfortunately don't know, I don't have the exact numbers. I created a form many years ago, which I lost through the years, that kind of put where they were from and what area. However, when I was going through the record of 1,400 men, records of 1,400 men, I came across Calvin. I'm like, what is Calvin? I've never heard of Calvin, Michigan. Calvin Township was kind of like a town there at that time. But Calvin Township, the west side of the state, was where a lot of these soldiers had came from. Cassopolis, Vandalia. I'm not sure how far there were. There were a few from Grand Rapids, but it wasn't a massive amount. But I would say primarily the majority of them came from the west side of the state. So I would be willing to say over half the regiment, if not over half, came from the west side of the state. While they were stationed in Detroit, that wasn't where quite a few of them were from the Detroit area, but people were coming from all over the state. And then sometimes, a lot of times, they would sometimes write where they enlisted at and not where they were from. So if they lived here in Holland and they went to Grand Rapids and joined, then they would say they might write Grand Rapids and not Holland, unfortunately, unless you look at their specific record in the National Archives, which said where they actually lived in some cases. So. But quite a few of them came from here. We had a lot of escaped slaves, freedom seekers who came to the north and settled and joined up to go back to the south. We're talking about John Taylor. Taylor was in Kentucky. He was a slave. He went down to the south. He already had his freedom. He had no reason. He didn't have to go back down to the south. He chose to go back down to the south to fight for that cause. And we had also escaped slaves that went to Canada and then came back to the United States to join in this regiment as well. For a variety of reasons. They want to help support the cause. Others maybe been looking for work. This is a way to get paid as well. But what's really neat is that these were people. This was a regiment that was all from Michigan for the most part, and they chose to go back to the South to fight. That's what makes it more unique than any other regiment in Michigan history. Not to discredit them, but this is the only regiment of African American soldiers that is totally on the mission to fight for freedom of others, an army to fight for the freedom of others. That's when they talk about how this is the first army in the world with a mission of fighting for the freedom of others. Wars are fought for land, territory, for others, and now this is the freedom. This was their mission. So, to answer your question, if you go online and look at the 102nd USCT roster, they're usually by company. You can pull up where they were from in the areas, but you'll notice a lot of them were from areas in the West. I believe there's a question back there.
I'm going to ask where the list was.
Yep. Yeah, there's a couple. Unfortunately, they are not always accurate. The different sources of information, so you kind of have to test your luck on which one to go. The best source of information are the Michigan Brown Books, which are published by the adjutant after the war, and those are very accurate records. However, yet they are individual, one by one, they are by company or whatever. So to look by where they're from, you'd have to look at every single person to see where they were from, unfortunately. Any other questions? An open book. Yes.
Do the descendants get together on a regular basis to keep it alive, so to speak?
Yeah, not to my knowledge. I haven't heard too much of that. We have the Sons of Union Veterans that is around today. That comes after the GAR. A lot of the descendants of Michigan soldiers from across the country who fought. But however, there's not really too many African Americans that are involved in the Sons of Union Veterans. Like really none at all, unfortunately. But to keep their memory alive when the original men were existing, they often took part in parades and reunions. They had a reunion. I know I researched in Detroit where the men came. Sometimes they would go to Lansing, they would get their battle flags back out of the Capitol building, excuse me, and they would parade in their areas with those battle flags that they fought with.
I was a little curious about the battle that you pictured up there, because we do it here in September. How does that work? Because here they'll pick a specific battle that they'll try to reenact. I wondered how, being black, which one or where
So there's not one in particular for this. This was actually a postal that's down in the Carolinas. There was a lot of regiments that were from stationed in South Carolina. They had installed a monument to the soldiers there, and we were down there. I'm trying to take that photograph, and it had some of the nice backdrops there. But that's not particularly doing anything in particular. Although when the Battle of the 102nd is usually that's usually picked for you to reenact, is usually Honeycomb, because that was their largest piece. Although the Canyon people really don't like us moving their guns and playing with them, because that they have insurance and they don't like that totally. But that's usually what occurs. In Jackson, the largest one that we have, we actually try not to do certain battles anymore. Reason being, and it's not to teach the history, it's because you can't reenact the Battle of Gettysburg with 200 people. It's doing a disservice in some cases. We want to present history as accurate as it can be, so we can give a glimpse of what the battle would have been like, just a generic scenario, but to try to do the Battle of XYZ with 200 people, 100 people, isn't totally the story that we will try to do. So we try to ensure that we are telling history as accurately as possible. That's what our group aims to do. So you see, we actually use, if you notice, everyone actually looks very similar. You can see some photos of reenactors who they're working on it. One of our goals is that we want to show exactly what those men had, exactly the same coat, hat, and so when you see what the 102nd would have looked like or asked, you see exactly what would have been presented to those men, what they would use. And that goes all the way down, and you might think it's overboard, but it goes all the way down to the sewing and the buttonholes. So you see, this is what they got, this is what they do, the shoes that they wore. In some cases, so we really want to show what it was like for those regiments. So we don't carry heavy rifles. No one's walking around ripping off loads. They had one rifle that was a musket, and that was what they had, 1 shot per minute. One shot per round. And if you're a good soldier, you get 3 shots per minute. So we aim to do the same accurate numbers. Any other questions? Nope.
Who was the first African American officer? When did they start appearing?
They didn't start appearing. I don't want to say in general because I don't know the factual answer. However, there were a couple African American officers during the Civil War, and there's one very predominant photo of him. If you look up Black Civil War officer, I don't know his name, and I don't know the story behind that. However, it was strictly prohibited that they were not to get such rank, but it did occur during the Civil War. So I could tell you that it did start during the Civil War. However, it could have happened earlier, and I just don't know that history enough to tell you that's wrong.
Were blacks allowed in the GAR building on Grand River and Bagley?
Sure. So I don't know the history of that building in particular. However, the majority of JR halls in Michigan were integrated. They were welcomed. But like I said, there were also some strictly black, primarily black, I should say, JR halls. There is a group probably in your area that may have that history, and there's for certain a book somewhere, and maybe you have it in this building, that is a GAR roster because they had them, and it says every unit they were involved. Because they had people from all over that moved from New York, or came from even Southerners, they weren't necessarily part of the GAR, but they may have been to the C unit, Kentucky unit, and they would be a part of the GAR hall. So I would imagine, unless there was some discrimination going on, that they would have been welcomed and may have took part in that. A lot of ways to have, like Cedar Rapids is a small town, still small, and even smaller back then. They had one man named Nat. I'm forgetting his last name, but I want to say Nat Davis, but he was the one African American member of the GAR, and you see the great big photo of all of the older gentlemen, and there was this one African American man, and his name was Nat, and he was part of it. So no, I don't know exactly for this one.
I realize you said your pictures weren't really of the 102nd, but in some of your early pictures, some of the black men looked like boys to me, looked like maybe 10 years old.
Right.
Was there an age limit? Like, what was going on with those very, very young people? I think it was one of your very first pictures. They looked
There we go. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so this gentleman here, I don't know his name off the top of my head, but this is a very well-known photograph that was just put across the country telling the story. So there was an age limit of 18 years old to be a soldier in the Union Army, to be a fighting soldier. However, it's the 1860s, there were no IDs and such in that fashion, no government searches. So people would lie and say they were 16. Say they were 18. I have a feeling John Taylor was actually younger than what I'm talking about. I think he was actually under 18 because he was 18 at the time and he was young when he was left. So I think you may have been actually underage as well. So what would have happened in this case is they were actually allowed to join, but they had to be a drummer or a musician during that time. And if they were old enough, then they would give them a rifle later if they turned 18. But in this case, this gentleman is probably 12 years old, for example, 12, 10 years old. And they were allowed. They saw some of the worst of the fighting. That they had to be a musician during the conflict. I think there's I'm trying to think of his name. I want to say, is it Johnny McClellan? There's a very predominant story of a young boy who really wanted to be involved. And he's I think it's like almost a TV show at one point in time, into the 40s, 50s. But anyways, they were young boys who would do musicians. This is a great example of, look what he came from to now he has a very new blue suit. And this was, I should know, I usually say, this was a huge piece to the soldiers to get a brand new uniform, to be a part of the Union Army. They were told for years that you were nothing, in some cases, you were property, whipped and mistreated in the South. Then you now get a blue uniform to be a part, you are a man now. In this, because you were respected by the federal government as a man, as a soldier, and being paid for such. And this was a huge piece, even to a young boy like this, to get to wear that uniform, a huge pride. We kind of get that with our reenactors, or some of our guys. I've had a couple students come in, and they put it on for the first time. I had one in particular who said, I feel like I'm a part of something. I feel my roots in this history, talking about it. So it goes all the way to today's generation, we're talking about that history. Any other questions? Yeah?
Okay, this is a leading question. I'm going to ask it anyway.
Sure.
How did they find the words in the flag?
Yeah. Sure. So we found.
The lost words on the battle flag.
Yeah. So when we have the battle flag and its
Can you see the pictures?
condition that we saw in, it looked like this on the left, and there's really no words there. You couldn't see anything there. It was all wrapped up. But we could kind of make out the words letters I and O on the wrap part of it, the very far left you can't really see. But the silk is very delicate. If we try to wrap on the lining and such, the flag could turn to dust in some cases. It could crack, stick together. So when it was sent out to the TPA, not too long after it was sent out to the TPA, I was doing some research, and I found the date that they were presenting their battle flags, and I went to that date, and it said they were presented with a beautiful battle flag, and a description of this flag was published in a recent article. And I went, oh, okay, that's awesome, because in some cases there's just nothing that you never know what it looks like in some cases. So I flipped back while I was in Lansing, the archives, doing some microfilm, and I found the article, this big article that talked about their battle flag, and it all was ripped out in this. It was like getting to the beautiful flag. It was made by this guy, and it says blah, and it was gone. And I went up, and if you're a historian, the urge. I went up to the desk. I'm like, we gotta find this, So they gave me a few different places on where to go, and I found a place that had some more microfilm in Ann Arbor. It was the Bentley Historical Library. So I drove to Ann Arbor, and I thought I was getting microfilm. I was not. They brought out the original newspapers, and there's giant papers during the 1860s. They bring out the papers, they drop it, and I must tell you, this is a few years ago. I'm only 21, going on 22 here in a week or two. They did not want to want to give me the book first, but we had a really great conversation, and becoming really respectful. And the stuff that we found was really cool in that article. So in that article, described the battle flag in detail, which is rare to find a detailed article that talks about what the flag looked like. I'm from Jackson. There was a handmade battle flag there, and I have no idea what it looks like because they don't describe it anywhere. They said, "There's a beautiful flag," and they don't tell it what it looks like. So we're very lucky. So we sent that newspaper over to a newspaper photograph over to Virginia, and from there she was able to go through what she had and piece together part of the wording there that's on the top part of the flag. So on the top part would have been a lot of the words on the bottom script there on the bottom. I'm sorry that this is very blurry. It's also far away, but I encourage you, visit the archives in Lansing, schedule an appointment. These are your battle flags. They belong to the people of Michigan. Check them out. It's really a moving experience. You'll see flags that are like, from the African American Regiment, other flags that fought at the Battle of Gettysburg, Antietam, the 24th Michigan, their flag. You can see in this slide here, they're big 6x1/2 flags. And the flag of the 24th Michigan that lost 7 color bearers is only this big. But they lost half of their flag over their time in service. So, yeah, it was a rough time. Yeah. Sure. Sure.
Former teacher here. But I belong to the North Berry Historical Museum in Berry County, and they had somebody come from the archive who came and did a wonderful presentation about all the flags and trying to restore them and all that. So that might be something.
That would be my incredible friend, Mr. Matt Van Acker, who is the chair of the Save the Flags Project. No, he's incredible. Telling that story, talking about the battle flags, and really the passion that these men had for them. Because we think, oh, flags, right? But no, this was your gift from the wives and the daughters and your brothers and such back home. And like I said, under no conditions, where they could give this flag to the enemy, and they took very well care of these flags. There's stories because these flags are put into the archives in Lansing, in the Capitol building, and they built the rotunda specifically to house the battle flag. The governor called it the state's most prized possessions, to take them in, these flags that fought in these various battles. And the stories of veterans going in there years later, and older gentlemen going in and pressing their face up to the glass and taking a look in the glimpse into the cases to view their battle flags and remembering.
He said that they were not allowed to touch the ground at all.
Right.
That's why they had so many different color bearers, because if one fell, they immediately find somebody else to take over.
Mm-hmm.
So you worked with the Save the Flags organization and with that? Okay.
Yep. So I had the grateful opportunity after doing that, kind of building some work with them. I became their first intern for the Save the Flags project for the Michigan State Capitol Commission itself. Worked and got to research and tell their story. I wrote a chapter on the first Michigan Colored Regiment. So I'd like to write a book one day. However, unfortunately in college still and very busy. So it's on my to-do list. But if you visit MichiganStateCapitol.com and go to battle flags and look at histories, you'll see an entire, they call it chapter, but it's, I don't know, 25 pages of history and such that talks about, maybe 30, that talks about this regiment, and they have several other regiments that they've gotten able to get to with the regiment, and did some other research on some other battle flags and their stories. But here you go.
Gentleman mentioned how they hadn't realized, they had all those flags in the rotunda, and he hadn't realized that they were deteriorating like crazy. And got moved to Virginia to help them restore things as much as possible.
So where are you going to school?
So I go to Jackson College currently.
Okay, what are you studying?
History.
I didn't know if you had any specialty or...
Yep. I just wrote a paper the other day on some Jackson Civil War soldiers. Talking about their history and such, but it's very neat. And my passion started with this regiment here. I got involved in the Civil War muster before I ever ran it, just as a local guy 14, and I was fascinated by all the black reenactors and got involved. And the first year was all about the guns and the battles and all that. And the second year, I started getting a little bit of the history. Not too long in 2017, I visited the battle flag collection. I'd heard that you could see the original battle flags. I was like, oh, it's cool. And when I was there, I was moved, and that's where it started. It was with that battle flag. We started this conversation of what did it look like, what is it? So I started researching, and then that took off into all of this research, becoming the state's lead historian on this regiment. The regiment hadn't really been newly researched since, in depth, since the 1960s and the centennial, so over 100 years, when they wrote some history on that and went through all the Detroit newspapers. So using newer technology and some newer archives, I've been able to check out a lot of variety of information and sources for this regiment. And, I don't have all of my history in this presentation, so I love questions because I know about a lot of variety of things as well pertaining to this regiment. But it's a very neat history, and I love to share it and talk about the bravery of these soldiers and remember that. We often talk about it's often, it is often said in some cases, and especially in today's tough world, that blacks did nothing to fight in the Civil War. This is, what we talk about in our group. That African Americans are portrayed as the victims of the Civil War, not the victors. And that's what I am in my presentation to talk about and with our group, to show that they were the victors, that over 160,000 African American, and higher numbers as far as 180,000 in some cases, fought for their freedom. They gave their part in that conflict. We want to remember them. There's an important quote, part in my language here, that I often share in some pieces, from a white man who was a veteran in this conflict. He was bullied. I use the term bullied. He was bullied. He was picked on because his friends, his fellow comrades, and people in his neighborhood would say, well, you served in nothing but that's all you served in. You weren't a real officer. And his response was, when he published this, he had a book that was written for one of his family relatives. They were 30 years older, and he passed not too long after this book was put together. And in his book, he says, he says that quote, where people say that, and he says, well, I am proud and would never change, and I'm certainly proud of that I was a leader in what these people call these soldiers were some of the best soldiers I ever worked with, and I would never treat them. And that was one of his things that he talked about, was, that he believed these colored soldiers, and they did themselves well. And I thought that was a really touching quote when I read that, that he strongly believed in his mission and his work in that regiment. One of the officers, I don't want to go any longer, I don't want to keep you guys, but I want to say that one of the officers actually was on the Michigan Supreme Court, goes to become a Michigan Supreme Court justice, and one of the gentlemen, William Webb Ferguson, had a case in Detroit after the war many years later, and it was a civil case where he was meeting he was a well-to-do man. He was visiting a friend in Detroit, and he went to a diner, and they told him that they had to sit in the colored section because he was with the white man was with the colored gentleman. So William Webb Ferguson was a black man. He went to see his friend in Detroit was a white gentleman. The white gentleman wanted to sit in the white part of the restaurant. They told me to move, and he said, well, I'm not Rosa Parks. I'm not moving. I'm going to sit here and eat my dinner. And they kick him out, and what he ends up doing is filing a lawsuit. He takes his case all the way up to the courts, to Michigan's highest court, and the Michigan Supreme Court in Lansing, that same building that still stands when the Supreme Court was there. And one of the justices that serves out there is a former leader and commander of this regiment. I think this is really neat. And he wins the case. He wins the case, and I think that part of that is because, we have people out here who had led colored soldiers into battle. And William Webb Ferguson goes on to become the first black state representative in Michigan history. There's a portrait of him hanging outside of the Michigan Supreme Court room, the old Michigan Supreme Court room at the Capitol building. So that's another tie-in to this regiment here, years later after the war. So,
Thank you. Thank you to all of you for being here, and have a good night. Drive safely.